Hello and welcome back. As you may remember, we are talking about energy production and sources of energy. Today, specifically, we're going to focus on three different sources of energy: oil, natural gas, and coal. These three are known as the fossil fuels. So today's topic is fossil fuels and some of the reasons why we can't live without them, and some important factors that I would like you to know going forward in our discussion about fossil fuels. Now, thinking back to the last time we were talking about sources of energy, there was a list, a pie graph of the 5 or 6 most consumed sources of energy in the planet. I'd like you to think back, what were those top 5? Hopefully you have some recollection. If you don't list them in order, you at least could name potentially these 5. The 5 are as follows: oil, coal, natural gas, biomass, and nuclear. Now, notice these top 3: oil, coal, and natural gas. These make up 80% overall of the total energy in the globe. Now, this is an important statistic. So, as much as we talk about trying to replace and get away from fossil fuels, that conversation is really talking about how do we get rid of 80% of the energy that we are currently using. That is a big part of the pie and something that can't happen overnight. So as we talk about these sources of energy, one of the biggest parts that is important when we talk about fossil fuels is that they are not renewable. Renewable means renewable over a reasonable timeline. So technically, yes, fossil fuels are made out of organic material. If that dies, decays under heat and pressure over many years, you can produce more fossil fuels. But in the terms of our human life cycle and timeline, that isn't something that we consider to be renewable. So the main conversation around these, besides climate change and environmental factors, is will we have enough of this to sustain us for the long haul? And this is a conversation that is continually coming up. For oil, there's a contributor several years ago by the name of Hubbert, and he was the first to kind of propose this idea of we could run out of oil. There was an age where it kind of seemed that oil was totally unlimited, that we have found this source of energy that we can just harvest and use however we want. But Hubbert came along and said, you know what, there is probably a certain amount of oil reserves that are available, and there will be a certain point where we have reached the peak. And the peak doesn't mean we have run out of oil. The peak just means that after a certain point, oil is going to be harder and harder to find, which makes it more expensive, and it is going to be less of a good option as we go. And Hubbert predicted this peak to be somewhere between 2000 and 2010. And whether or not you followed this very closely, you may have realized that we haven't actually hit this peak. You probably would have heard about that. So Hubbert was wrong in this prediction. Things have been changing. His prediction is kind of like this idea of like a coffee carafe, that the coffee isn't gone, but after a certain amount, when you're pouring that out, it gets harder and harder to get those last drops out. So, as we talked about, this peak didn't come to fruition. That peak has been pushed farther and farther along. And that is because different technologies have come around to allow us to harvest this oil, this energy from the ground in different ways. So the old way of drilling, this forgive the rudimentary example here. The old way of drilling is like drilling into a jelly donut. You've got this oil reserve, it's just sitting there. You just gotta take an oil drill and then get to that spot. It's potentially miles down into the earth, but once you get there, it's very easy to pump. And for the most part, a lot of these old oil wells have been depleted, especially in the US. This is less and less common for how we are getting our oil here in the US. Now, the new way of drilling is kind of like you're drilling into tiramisu. Instead of finding this layer, instead you go in and then you actually drill horizontally using a tool called fracking that we'll talk about in a little bit. We're able to recover even more oil than we thought we could, which means that our forecasts are changing. The projections, because of these new technologies, keep pushing out farther and farther into the future. So what that's looked like is if we graph our proved reserves, which basically is a fancy way of saying here's how much oil we think is left down there. You'll notice for a long time the proved reserves were going down. That's kind of what you'd expect. As we use oil, we expect that there's less oil down in the ground. But after about 2007, 2008, notice what's happened to this line, both for oil and for natural gas. We've seen this huge increase in the proved reserves, which feels weird. Like we have taken oil out. Why is there more there now? A proved reserve doesn't mean it's just oil that's down there. It's the oil that we are able to access that's down there. So as we have new technologies that allow us to access oil that we previously couldn't, those proved reserves go up. So what that means is it's a moving target when we're talking about how much is left. Here's one estimation that you can find. And this estimation, like I said, is very much an estimate and is changing from year to year. And this estimation says that we have about 50 or so years of oil remaining if we currently use at the current rate, about 50 or so years of natural gas, and about 100 years or so of coal. So the answer to are we running out is yes, but as we think we are running out, there are new ways of harvesting. So while this can't sustain us for the long haul, it will be able to for the near future without much problem. So the US does not produce all of its own oil. Because of fracking and these new technologies, been able to produce a lot more of it than we used to be able to. But we still import a bunch of that oil into the US from other places. Here is a list of some of the biggest oil importers. I would like you to predict to yourself which of these countries is the largest importer of oil to the US. Now, the answer might surprise you because you often think about oil coming from the Middle East, so Saudi Arabia, or you may have heard Venezuela has a lot of oil. But our largest importer by far is Canada. Canada is where most of our imported oil comes from, and it's not even really that close. If you were to graph these side by side, notice where Canada comes in as far as our imports. Now, the OPEC countries, there are several countries that have banded together to help control the price of oil. They are sometimes lumped together, so they are not just one country, but Canada, for singling out one country at a time, is by far the largest importer of oil. And you'll notice that the oil production has been increasing as we go. And the reason for that is the supply goes up to meet the demand. One thing I want to point out here, specifically for the US, is notice what happened here. In the US, it has a lot to do with that proved oil reserves graph that we saw before. But with the influx of new technologies, notice the amount of oil that the US is producing every year has gone up dramatically since the early 2000s. And that is important. That is something that you hear about a lot in the news. It's something that has an effect on the price of oil and then therefore the price of gasoline as well. And the proved oil reserves in the US are in states that you've probably heard of having a lot of oil. North Dakota, one of our neighbors, has a lot of oil in shale rock, so access through fracking, which we'll talk about. Oklahoma and Texas are big producers of oil, as well as the Gulf of Mexico. Oil is often very appealing because it's pretty easy to transport. Um, you don't have to necessarily pile it up onto a train. You don't have to put it on boats. You don't have to put it on trucks. Instead, you can transport oil by pipeline. You can just send it from one place to another without having to use transportation, one truck or one train load at a time. And you've probably heard of pipelines in the news. There are a couple of readings that I'd like you to look at about this. The Dakota Access Pipeline is not too far from us, as well as the Keystone XL pipeline. And there is a grid of different pipelines throughout the US, and most of these pipelines are leading towards some sort of refinery that refines that oil into other products that can be used like gasoline or different kerosenes or different types of oil that's in that pure petroleum. And as I mentioned, we don't get all of our oil from the US. The US produces about 75%, maybe a little bit more these days, of the total oil that we use. 25% is imported, which doesn't seem like a huge piece of the pie, but if that 25% went away, we'd have to make huge life changes with how transportation is going, and the cost of gasoline would go up dramatically. So something that is often talked about, especially in politics, is how much we as a nation are dependent on other countries uh, to receive the oil that we are using. And one of my favorite clips is from The Daily Show back when Jon Stewart was the host. And I want to play you a short clip from that. It is a phenomenal look at the history of the US's independence or lack thereof when it comes to oil. The US the US also has a source of oil that we are saving essentially for a rainy day. The US has a strategic petroleum reserve, sometimes known as the SPR, and that is a salt cavern down in Louisiana and Texas here. And it's an old salt cavern that houses about a little over 700 million barrels of oil. And this oil is typically bought when oil prices are low and stored down there just in case. So in case the prices get really high, we can produce more of that and put it back into the market. If something were to happen that we are not able to access the oil from overseas, or there's some sort of conflict that prevents us from doing that, this is enough to cover about 4 months worth of imports as necessary. So it's kind of an interesting thing. A lot of people don't even know it exists, but it is a huge amount of oil that we are storing kind of for this rainy day. You may have heard of this in the news recently with the price of oil going down. There's been talk of buying as much oil as we can while the price is low to top up this petroleum reserve now.